Good morning, dear readers. Pull up a chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and settle in. There's something special about a summer morning that still carries the quiet of an earlier age, when village greens were the centre of the world, and secrets travelled more slowly than the buses. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been to a village summer fair where everything felt just a little too perfect? I'd love to hear your memories. If these gentle mysteries keep you company, a quiet subscribe means the world to us here at Stories with Jane. Thank you for being part of this little circle. And now, without further fuss. Chapter 1. The Shadow at the Summer Fair. Miss Jane Marple arrived in the village of Little Melford on a Thursday afternoon in late July, carrying only a small suitcase and a parcel of knitting. The train had been delayed at the junction, and the station master had apologised 3 times in the same apologetic tone he used for every inconvenience. She had smiled and said it was of no consequence. In truth, the extra half-hour had given her time to notice the young man on the platform, who kept glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone he did not wish to meet. Little Melford lay in a fold of the Sussex Downs, a place of thatched roofs, carefully tended gardens, and a green that had hosted the summer fair for as long as anyone could remember. Miss Marple's goddaughter, Mrs. Helen Carrington, had written the previous week to say the fair this year was to be quite the event, and that an extra pair of hands and eyes would be welcome. Helen had always been practical. She had also always known when her godmother's particular brand of observation might prove useful. The cottage stood at the far end of the green, its white gate freshly painted. Helen met her at the door, slightly flushed from arranging flowers. "Jane, you look exactly as you always do. Calm, and as if nothing in the world could surprise you. Come in, tea's ready." The sitting room smelled of roses and beeswax. Through the open window came the distant sound of hammering, as stalls were being erected on the green. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and listened while Helen explained the arrangements. The fair was to open at 2 o'clock on Saturday. There would be the usual stalls, cakes, jam, second-hand books, a tombola that never quite paid for itself, and a small stage for the local children's choir. The novelty this year was a fortune-teller's tent, provided by a woman from Brighton who called herself Madame Zelda. Helen lowered her voice slightly when she mentioned the name. "She's staying at the Red Lion, rather theatrical. Silk scarves and too many rings. The vicar's wife is not entirely pleased, but the committee voted her in. People do love a bit of mystery, don't they?" Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "They do, though mystery has a way of arriving whether one invites it or not." That evening they walked across the green. The stalls stood like half-built ships, their canvas sides flapping in the mild breeze. Near the centre, a large oak tree cast a long shadow that reached almost to the fortune-teller's tent, already pitched and closed. A single lantern hung outside it, unlit. A tall man in a linen suit was speaking with the carpenter, who was fixing the steps to the stage. Helen introduced him as Major Hugh Denham, recently returned from India and now living in the old rectory. He had a clipped moustache and the careful manners of a man who had spent years giving orders and receiving them. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "Helen has spoken of you. I hope you will find our little fair amusing." "I rarely find village affairs merely amusing," she replied. "They are usually more instructive than one expects." He looked at her for a moment longer than politeness required, then smiled and moved on. As they turned back toward the cottage, Miss Marple noticed a young woman standing near the oak tree. She wore a plain grey dress and held a small notebook. When she saw them looking, she closed the book quickly and walked away toward the churchyard path. "That's Miss Evelyn Hart," Helen said. "She boards at Mrs. Ames's and helps with the school accounts. Quiet girl, keeps to herself." Miss Marple said nothing, but she watched the path until the grey figure disappeared among the yews. Friday passed in a pleasant haze of final preparations. Miss Marple spent the morning in the cottage garden, knitting and observing the comings and goings on the green. She saw Madame Zelda arrive in a small motor car driven by a young man with dark hair and a restless manner. He carried several boxes into the tent and emerged looking irritated. Madame Zelda herself was a solid woman in her 40s, with henna'd hair and a voice that carried. She spoke sharply to the young man, who shrugged and walked off toward the Red Lion. In the afternoon, Miss Marple accompanied Helen to the church hall, where the cake stall was being organised. Mrs. Ames, the landlady, was there, as was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Latham, who made no secret of her disapproval of the fortune-teller. "It encourages superstition," Mrs. Latham said firmly. "And that young man who drives her about. I've seen him before. He was at the fair in Eastbourne last year, when there was that unpleasantness with the missing purse." Helen soothed her with offers of more tea. Miss Marple listened and said little. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when they believed no one was particularly listening. That night the wind rose. Miss Marple woke once to the sound of it moving through the oak on the green. She lay still, listening, and thought she heard footsteps, light, deliberate, crossing the grass and then stopping. When she rose and looked out, the green was empty under a thin moon. Only the fortune-teller's tent stirred, its canvas shifting like something breathing. Saturday dawned clear and warm. By noon, the green was crowded with villagers in their best clothes. Children ran between the stalls. The smell of strawberries and crushed grass filled the air. Miss Marple sat on a bench near the oak, her knitting in her lap, watching. Madame Zelda's tent did a steady trade. People emerged looking thoughtful, amused, or faintly unsettled. Major Denham went in and came out after only a few minutes, his face unreadable. Miss Evelyn Hart approached the tent twice and turned away both times without entering. At 3:30, the children's choir assembled on the stage. Their thin, earnest voices rose into the summer air. Miss Marple found herself watching the oak tree rather than the singers. Its shadow had lengthened, stretching across the grass until it touched the entrance of the fortune-teller's tent. A sudden murmur ran through the crowd near the tent. Someone had cried out, a short, sharp sound, quickly stifled. People turned. A woman in a flowered hat pushed her way out of the tent, pale and shaking. "She's gone," the woman said. "Madame Zelda, she's not there. The chair's empty and the cards are scattered. And there's—" She stopped, hand to her mouth. Major Denham was the first to reach the tent. He held the flap open. Miss Marple, moving more slowly, followed with Helen close behind. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and something sharper, like crushed mint. The small table was overturned. Tarot cards lay face up across the grass floor. The tower, the moon, the hanged man. The chair behind the table was empty. A single silk scarf, deep red, lay half hidden beneath the table's edge, as though it had been dropped in haste. And on the canvas wall, just above where Madame Zelda would have sat, a long, thin shadow had been drawn in charcoal. A silhouette of a woman seated, head slightly bowed, one hand raised as if in warning or farewell. It was precise, almost elegant, and entirely out of place. Major Denham's voice was tight. "She's been taken, or she's run. Either way, this is no accident." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the charcoal shadow. Outside, the children's choir continued to sing, their voices pure and unaware. The oak's real shadow had moved on, leaving the green in bright, ordinary sunlight. But inside the tent the drawn shadow remained, still and watching. Miss Marple touched Helen's arm gently. "I think," she said in her quiet, unhurried way, "we had better find out who has been paying attention to the wrong things." She stepped back into the sunlight, already beginning to notice the faces that looked too carefully blank, the hands that moved a little too quickly, and the one person who was no longer standing where they had been a moment before. The summer fair continued around them, bright and cheerful, as if nothing at all had happened. But Miss Marple knew better. In villages, as in gardens, the prettiest blooms sometimes hid the sharpest thorns. Chapter 2. The Empty Chair and the Charcoal Line. The children's choir finished their last song while the tent was still being examined. Their thin, clear voices drifted across the green as if nothing unusual had occurred, and for a moment the village tried to pretend the same. Then the murmur began in earnest, soft at first, like wind through dry grass, then louder as words spread from stall to stall. Miss Marple remained near the oak, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She watched faces rather than the tent. People revealed more when they believed the important business was happening elsewhere. Major Denham had taken charge with the brisk efficiency of a man used to crisis. He ordered the tent flaps closed and asked the local constable, young, freckled, and clearly overwhelmed, to keep the curious at a distance. Helen stood beside Miss Marple, twisting the strap of her handbag. "Jane," she said quietly, "do you think she simply walked away?" Madame Zelda always struck me as the sort who might leave if the mood took her. "Possibly," Miss Marple answered, "but people who walk away rarely leave charcoal drawings behind, or overturned tables, or the particular expression I saw on that young woman's face when she first cried out." The woman in the flowered hat, Mrs. Edith Rowe, who ran the post office, had been given a chair and a cup of tea. She sat trembling, repeating the same few sentences. She had entered the tent at 20 minutes to 4. Madame Zelda had been seated, cards already laid out. They had spoken for less than a minute. Then Madame Zelda had looked past her, toward the back of the tent, and her face had changed. She had risen, said something soft that Mrs. Rowe could not catch, and stepped behind the curtain that divided the small space. Mrs. Rowe had waited. When the silence grew too long, she had peered around the curtain and found nothing but an empty chair and scattered cards. "And the shadow," Mrs. Rowe added, her voice dropping. "It wasn't there when I went in. I'm certain of it. The canvas was plain." Miss Marple thanked her gently and moved on. The young man who had driven Madame Zelda's motor car was found leaning against the side of the Red Lion, smoking with more force than the cigarette required. His name was Tommy Graves. He wore a cheap suit a size too large and had the restless eyes of someone who expected trouble and usually found it. Major Denham questioned him first. Miss Marple stood a little apart, appearing to examine a tray of homemade jam, but she heard every word. Tommy claimed he had been in the public bar the entire afternoon. The landlord confirmed it, though he added that Tommy had stepped outside twice for air. The second time had been around 3:30. He had returned looking flushed and had ordered a second pint without speaking. When Miss Marple approached him later, she did not mention the tent. She spoke instead of the heat and the dust and the difficulty of finding good help these days. Tommy relaxed by degrees. He admitted he had driven Madame Zelda for 3 summers. She paid well and asked few questions. He did not like the village. Too many eyes, too many people who remembered faces. "She had a letter this morning," he said suddenly. "Came with the early post. She read it in the car and went quiet. Didn't speak all the way here." "Did you see the writing?" Miss Marple asked. He shook his head. "Only that it was on thick paper, cream-coloured, smelled a bit of lavender." Miss Marple filed the detail away. By 5 o'clock the fair had thinned. Parents gathered children. Stall-holders began packing. The oak's shadow had swung fully round and now stretched toward the churchyard path. Miss Marple walked that path slowly, her eyes on the ground. Near the lich gate, she found Miss Evelyn Hart sitting on a low stone wall, notebook open on her knees. The young woman looked up, startled, then closed the book with deliberate care. "Miss Marple," she said, "I didn't hear you. I walk quietly. Habit." Miss Marple sat beside her without invitation. "You did not go into the tent today." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the notebook. "I changed my mind. Twice. Superstition is foolish, yet sometimes the past feels closer at fairs. Music and people and the smell of crushed grass. It brings things back." "What things?" Evelyn looked toward the green. "Nothing that would interest the police. Only old mistakes. The kind one carries alone." Miss Marple did not press. She had learned that silence often drew more truth than questions. After a moment, Evelyn spoke again, almost to herself. Madame Zelda knew something, or pretended to. Last year, at another fair, she told a woman her husband was not dead, only gone. The woman believed her. It caused difficulty. Was that woman from this village? Evelyn's face closed. "I couldn't say." She rose, brushed imaginary dust from her skirt, and walked toward Mrs. Ames's boarding house without looking back. Evening settled gently. Helen insisted Miss Marple rest, but rest was impossible while the puzzle remained unfinished. After supper they returned to the green. The tent still stood, now guarded by the young constable and lit by a single lantern. Major Denham was speaking with the vicar. When he saw Miss Marple, he came across at once. "We've searched the immediate area," he said. "No sign of her. No struggle beyond the tent. The charcoal, it's odd. Done with a stick from the woodpile behind the stalls. Fresh. Whoever drew it took time. Steady hand." Miss Marple regarded the closed tent. A steady hand and a clear intention. The cards that fell face up were the Tower, the Moon, and the Hanged Man. Destruction, illusion, and suspension. Someone either knew the meanings or chose them with care. Denham's mouth tightened. "You believe this is deliberate?" "I believe very little as yet. But I notice that the shadow on the canvas faces the entrance, as if the seated figure were watching whoever came in, or watching whoever left." A soft sound came from the direction of the churchyard, the scrape of a shoe on gravel. Both turned. The path lay empty under the rising moon. Only the yews moved slightly in the breeze. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Major, has anyone examined the letter Tommy Graves mentioned, the one that arrived this morning?" "Not yet. We haven't found her belongings. She kept a small case at the Red Lion. The landlord says it is still locked in her room. Then perhaps we should look at it before morning. Letters have a way of explaining absences, or deepening them." Denham hesitated, then nodded. "I'll arrange it. Will you come?" "If I may. An old woman's eyes are sometimes useful with handwriting." They walked toward the inn together. Behind them, the oak stood dark against the sky, its branches still. The charcoal shadow remained inside the tent, unseen now, yet present, as though the fair had left behind more than crushed grass and empty stalls. Miss Marple glanced once over her shoulder. For a moment she thought she saw a figure near the tree, slender and motionless. When she looked again, there was only moonlight and the slow settling of night over Little Melford. Somewhere in the village a clock struck 8. The sound carried clearly across the green, marking the hour when the summer fair should have been ending in laughter and tired children. Instead it ended in questions, and the first quiet certainty that Madame Zelda had not simply walked away. Someone had drawn her shadow for a reason, and someone, Miss Marple suspected, was still watching to see who noticed. Chapter 3. The Locked Case and the Scent of Lavender. The Red Lion stood at the corner of the Green and the High Street, its sign creaking softly in the evening air. Inside, the public bar still held a few late drinkers who fell silent when Major Denham entered with Miss Marple. The landlord, a broad man named Wilkins with the permanent look of someone expecting complaint, led them upstairs without comment. He unlocked the door to the small back room Madame Zelda had taken and stepped aside. "She paid for 3 nights," he said. "Came alone except for that young fellow who carried her bags. I've not touched a thing." The room was neat to the point of severity. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a wardrobe with the door slightly ajar. On the floor beside the bed sat a worn leather case, its brass clasps closed. The air held a faint trace of the same incense that had filled the tent, mixed now with something cleaner and sharper. Major Denham tried the clasps. Locked. He glanced at Miss Marple. "I carry a small set of keys for such occasions," she said mildly. "One never knows when an old lock will prove stubborn." From her handbag, she produced a modest ring of skeleton keys she had acquired years earlier for reasons she never fully explained. The third key turned with a soft click. Inside the case lay folded silk scarves, a deck of tarot cards still in their box, a small bottle of perfume, and a thin bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. On top rested a single envelope of thick cream paper, already opened. The scent of lavender rose clearly as Miss Marple lifted it. The letter was short, written in a careful, slightly formal hand. "You were seen at Eastbourne, the woman remembers. If you speak of what you were told that night, the past will not remain buried. Leave Little Melford before the fair ends, or the shadow will find you first." There was no signature. Miss Marple read it twice, then handed it to the Major. His face hardened. "Threat," he said. "Clear enough. And timed for this weekend." "Yes." Miss Marple's gaze moved around the room. Yet she did not leave. She set up her tent and took customers. That suggests either courage or the belief that she held some advantage. She examined the other letters briefly. Most were ordinary. Bookings from village committees, a note from a Brighton landlady about unpaid rent. One, older and creased, was written in a different hand entirely, hurried, uneven, and signed only with the initial E. I cannot come to you. They watch the house. If you still keep the locket, burn it. Some truths are safer forgotten. Miss Marple held the page to the light. The paper was cheap. The ink had faded at the edges. She refolded it carefully and returned it to the bundle. Major Denham was examining the wardrobe. Nothing of use. Clothes, a spare pair of shoes, a railway timetable. No purse, no money. If she left with nothing. Or someone took what mattered, Miss Marple replied. They locked the case again and gave it into the constable's keeping. Downstairs, Wilkins confirmed that Madame Zelda had eaten an early lunch in the dining room and had seemed distracted. She had asked once whether the afternoon post had arrived. When told it had not, she had gone upstairs and remained there until it was time to walk to the green. Outside, the high street was nearly empty. A single lamp burned above the post office. Miss Marple paused beneath it. Major, the letter speaks of Eastbourne. Mrs. Latham mentioned unpleasantness there last year, involving a missing purse, and Miss Hart spoke of a woman told her husband was not dead, only gone. These pieces may belong to the same cloth. Denham nodded slowly. I'll send word to the Eastbourne police in the morning, quietly. They parted at the corner of the green. Miss Marple walked back to Helen's cottage under a sky thick with stars. The oak tree stood black and still. The fortune-teller's tent had been taken down. Only the trampled grass and a faint rectangular mark remained where it had stood. Yet in Miss Marple's mind the charcoal shadow lingered, seated and watchful. Helen was waiting with cocoa and questions. Miss Marple answered only some of them. She spoke of the letter and the threat, but she kept the older note signed E to herself for the present. Some details needed time to settle before they were shared. Later, alone in the guest room, she sat by the open window with her knitting. The needles moved steadily while her thoughts arranged themselves. A woman who told fortunes and collected secrets. A letter promising that the past would not stay buried. A young woman who turned away from the tent twice. A driver who stepped outside for air at the critical hour. And a major who had returned from India with careful manners and eyes that missed little. Somewhere in the village a dog barked once and fell silent. Miss Marple's needles paused. She was thinking of the charcoal line, the precision of it, the time it must have taken. A person who draws a shadow while a woman vanishes is not acting in panic. They are making a statement, or leaving a signature. A soft sound reached her from the garden below, the latch of the gate, lifted and lowered with care. Miss Marple rose and looked out. The path was empty. Only the roses moved in the night air, their pale blooms distinct against the darker hedge. She remained at the window a long while, listening. When she finally returned to her chair, she picked up the knitting again, but her eyes stayed on the darkness beyond the glass. In the morning, she decided, she would speak with Miss Evelyn Hart alone, and she would ask to see the notebook the young woman guarded so carefully. Some shadows, Miss Marple knew, were drawn to be seen. Others were drawn to warn that they had already been noticed. The clock in the hall struck 10. Little Melford slept, or pretended to, and somewhere among its quiet houses the person who had held the charcoal stick was still awake, waiting to learn whether the warning had been understood. Chapter 4. The Notebook and the Name Left Unspoken. Morning came bright and still, the kind of summer morning that made the events of the previous day feel almost unreal. Yet when Miss Marple stepped into Helen's garden after breakfast, the trampled rectangle of grass where the fortune-teller's tent had stood remained clearly visible, a pale scar on the green. She found Miss Evelyn Hart in the small sitting room of Mrs. Ames's boarding house, sorting papers at a table by the window. The young woman looked up quickly, then rose with careful politeness. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Ames said you might call. I hope I do not interrupt important work. Only the school accounts. They can wait." Evelyn gestured to a chair. Her notebook lay closed beside the papers, one finger resting on its cover as though to keep it from opening of its own accord. Miss Marple sat, arranged her handbag, and spoke of ordinary things first: the weather, the success of the cake stall, the way the children's choir had sung despite the disturbance. Only when the silence between them had settled into something almost companionable did she turn to the matter at hand. "You were near the tent yesterday," she said gently, "and you chose not to enter. I wonder whether that choice was made only yesterday, or whether it began earlier." Evelyn's hand tightened on the notebook. For a moment, she seemed ready to deny everything. Then her shoulders lowered a fraction. "I knew her," she said. "Not well, not in the way people mean when they say they know someone. But I knew what she did. At Eastbourne last summer, she told a woman her husband was alive. The woman had been told he was dead, lost at sea 2 years before. Madame Zelda's words undid the little peace the woman had managed to build. There was a scene, accusations, a purse went missing in the confusion. Nothing was ever proved, but the woman left the town soon after. Her name was not spoken here. People prefer their scandals at a distance." Miss Marple waited. Evelyn opened the notebook at last. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures and, on later sheets, short entries in a smaller hand. She turned to a page near the middle and held it so Miss Marple could see. August 14th, Eastbourne, the woman in blue, locket mentioned. Initials inside, HD, she believed. She should not have. "I wrote it down because I was frightened," Evelyn said. "Not of Madame Zelda, of what happens when someone stirs the past without understanding the cost. The woman in blue came to this village once, years ago. She stayed only a week. Then she was gone. Some said she returned to the coast. Others said she simply disappeared into a quieter life. I never learned which was true." Miss Marple studied the initials. HD. Her mind moved at once to Major Hugh Denham, newly returned, living in the old rectory, manners careful, eyes watchful. "Did Madame Zelda ever speak of a locket to you directly?" she asked. "No, but she looked at me yesterday morning when I passed the tent, as though she recognized me from somewhere she could not quite place, or as though she was deciding whether I was worth the risk of speaking." Evelyn closed the notebook. "I turned away twice because I was afraid of what she might say if I sat down. Some truths once spoken cannot be taken back, and some people would rather silence the speaker than face what was said." A soft knock came at the sitting-room door. Mrs. Ames entered with a tray of tea, her expression bright with curiosity she made no effort to hide. The conversation shifted at once to safer ground: the quality of the jam at the fair, the need for new hymn books at the church. Miss Marple accepted a cup, thanked Evelyn for her time, and left soon after. Outside, the high street was quiet. She walked slowly toward the green, turning the initials over in her mind. HD. It was not proof. Initials could belong to many people. Yet the Major had gone into the tent the previous afternoon and emerged after only a few minutes, his face unreadable, and the threatening letter had spoken of a woman who remembered. At the edge of the green she met Major Denham himself. He was speaking with the young constable, but broke off when he saw her. "Miss Marple, I've had a reply from Eastbourne. The incident with the purse was noted, but no charges were brought. The woman involved gave her name as Mrs. Helen Draycott. She left a forwarding address that proved false. No one has heard of her since. Helen Draycott, HD." Miss Marple's expression did not change. How very complete of them to remember the name after a year. "Local memory is long when money goes missing," Denham replied. He hesitated, then added, "I have been thinking about the charcoal shadow. A person who takes time to draw while a woman vanishes is either supremely confident or wishes the drawing to be found. I lean toward the second." "So do I," Miss Marple said. "A signature, of a kind, or a warning meant for someone specific who would understand its meaning." They parted with the polite phrases of village acquaintance. Miss Marple continued across the green, her steps unhurried. She was thinking of the older letter in Madame Zelda's case, the one signed only with the initial E, and of Evelyn's careful hands on the notebook. She was thinking, too, of the soft sound at Helen's gate the night before. When she reached the cottage, she found Helen in the garden, cutting roses. The stems bled a little sap onto her gloves. "Jane," Helen said, "you look as though you have been collecting more than the morning air." "Only pieces," Miss Marple answered. "And pieces, my dear, are never safe until one knows which of them fit." She went upstairs to the guest room and sat by the window with her knitting. The needles moved in steady rhythm while the village went about its ordinary Saturday business. Yet beneath the ordinary, something waited, the locket with the initials, the woman who had believed a fortune-teller and then vanished from the record, the charcoal figure still seated in memory, head slightly bowed, one hand raised. Miss Marple paused in her work and looked toward the place where the tent had stood. The grass was beginning to lift again, erasing the mark. But some marks, she knew, did not fade so easily. In the quiet of the room, she spoke a single name under her breath, testing its weight. Helen Draycott. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, and for a moment the garden fell into soft shadow. Chapter 5. The Rectory Gate and the Weight of Initials. The afternoon was warm enough for the bees to move slowly among Helen's roses. Miss Marple sat in the shade of the cottage porch with her knitting, but the needles clicked with less than their usual steady patience. The name Helen Draycott had settled in her mind like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples were still spreading. She had asked Helen Carrington, carefully, whether the name meant anything to her. Helen had frowned, considered, and shaken her head. "I've never heard it." "Why?" "It surfaced in connection with last year's trouble at Eastbourne. Nothing certain, only a name that shares initials with someone who lives here now." Helen's hands stilled on the stem she was trimming. "You mean Major Denham?" "I mean the possibility. Nothing more." After a moment, Helen said, "He's been kind since he came. Helped with the church roof fund. Speaks little of India, but that is common enough with men who have seen service." "Do you truly think—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that it is too soon for thinking of that kind. I prefer looking." She looked first at the old rectory. It stood at the far end of the village, beyond the churchyard, a square house of faded brick with tall windows and a garden that had been restored with quiet expense. The gate was black iron, newly painted. Miss Marple arrived there at 4 o'clock, carrying a small basket of Helen's roses as a neighbourly offering. Major Denham received her in the drawing-room, where the furniture still looked slightly unfamiliar with its surroundings, as though it had not yet decided to stay. "Miss Marple, this is an unexpected pleasure. I was passing, and Helen insisted the roses should not be wasted. They are at their best for only a few days." He took the basket with correct thanks and set it on a side table. A silver-framed photograph stood there, a younger Denham in uniform, standing beside a woman whose face was turned slightly away from the camera. The woman's hair was dark. A small locket hung at her throat. Miss Marple's eyes rested on it only a moment before moving on, but the Major noticed. "My late wife," he said. "She died while I was still abroad. A fever. Very sudden. I am sorry. It was some years ago." He poured tea with a steady hand. "You have been asking questions about Eastbourne, I believe." The constable mentioned it. "I ask questions about many things. Habit of age." Denham sat opposite her. "Then I shall save you the trouble of asking the next one." "Yes, I was in Eastbourne last August. Briefly. I had business with a solicitor regarding my wife's small estate. I did not attend the fair. I did not consult any fortune-teller, and I have never heard the name Helen Draycott until this morning." The denial was clear, complete, and delivered without heat. Miss Marple accepted her cup and sipped. "Yet the initials match," she said. "They match many people. My wife's name was Harriet. Harriet Denham. The locket in the photograph was hers. It contained a lock of her mother's hair. Nothing more mysterious than that." He spoke with the calm of a man placing facts on a table one by one. Miss Marple listened and watched. The hand that held his cup was steady. The eyes that met hers did not shift. Yet when she mentioned the charcoal shadow, he looked away for the first time, toward the window that faced the churchyard. "I dislike theatrical gestures," he said. "Whoever drew that figure wished to be noticed. I prefer enemies who declare themselves plainly." "And do you have such enemies, Major?" A faint smile. "Every man who has served long enough acquires a few. None, so far as I know, who deal in tarot cards and charcoal." They spoke a little longer of the fair and the vicar's hopes for the roof. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Denham walked her to the gate. The iron was warm under her hand. "If you learn anything further about Mrs. Draycott," he said, "I would be obliged if you told me. A false name used near the time of my visit makes me uneasy." "I shall remember." She walked back through the churchyard. The yews were dark and close. Near the far wall she paused. A small bunch of wildflowers, speedwell and buttercups, had been laid on an unmarked patch of grass. They were fresh. The stems had been cut that morning. Miss Marple stood looking at them for some time. No headstone, no name, only the quiet offering of someone who remembered a place, even if the village did not. When she returned to the cottage, Helen was in the kitchen. Miss Marple said nothing of the photograph or the flowers. Some observations needed to ripen before they were spoken aloud. That evening, the young constable came to the door with a message from Major Denham. The Eastbourne police had found an old lodging-house register. A Mrs. Helen Draycott had stayed 3 nights in early August the previous year. She had listed her occupation as widow, and her next destination simply as the country. No further trace. Miss Marple received the news with a small nod. After the constable left, she sat by the window with her knitting and let the pieces turn slowly in her mind. A woman who had been told her husband lived. A locket with the initials H.D., a major whose late wife shared those initials. A fortune-teller who received a threat and then vanished. A charcoal shadow drawn with care while the green was full of music and children. Outside, the light faded. The green grew quiet. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, a gate closed with a soft, final sound. Miss Marple's needles stopped. She was no longer certain the shadow on the canvas had been meant as a warning to Madame Zelda. It might have been meant as a message to someone else entirely, someone who would look at the seated figure and understand exactly which past had refused to stay buried. She took up her knitting again, but her eyes remained on the darkening garden, waiting for the next small movement that would tell her the story was still unfolding. Chapter 6. The unmarked grass and the cut stems. Morning light lay soft across the churchyard when Miss Marple pushed open the lich-gate. The air still held the coolness of night, and the yews stood dark and unmoving. She walked without hurry to the far wall, where the small bunch of wildflowers had lain the previous afternoon. They were gone. In their place the grass showed a faint, darker circle, as though the stems had been lifted carefully and the earth pressed flat again. Miss Marple stood looking down for a long moment. Someone had returned after she left. Someone who did not wish the offering to be noticed twice. She was still there when the vicar, Mr. Latham, came along the path with a watering can. He greeted her with the mild surprise of a man who expected the churchyard to remain empty until later in the day. "Miss Marple, you're about early. I find the light at this hour clarifying," she replied. "I wonder, Mr. Latham, has this particular patch of ground ever held a marker, even a temporary one?" The vicar looked at the grass, then at her. His expression grew careful. "Not in my time. There are 1 or 2 older graves whose stones were removed when they became unsafe. The records are incomplete for the years before the war. Why do you ask?" "Only curiosity. I saw flowers here yesterday. Fresh ones. They are gone this morning." Mr. Latham was silent for a few seconds. People sometimes leave things without explanation. Grief does not always require a name. He shifted the watering can. "If you learn more, I would rather not have the village inventing stories. We have had enough of those since the fair." Miss Marple agreed that invention was rarely helpful, and continued her walk. She did not tell him that the flowers had been speedwell and buttercups, common, local, and cut with a clean blade. At the Red Lion she found Tommy Graves sitting on the bench outside, turning his empty cigarette packet over in his hands. He looked as though he had slept poorly. When he saw her, he straightened. then seemed to decide there was no point in pretense. "You're the one asking all the questions," he said. "I ask only some of them. The rest ask themselves." He gave a short, humourless sound. She was scared. Madame Zelda. Not the usual kind of scared, money or the law. The other kind. The kind that looks over its shoulder, even when the street is empty. That letter shook her. She told me to wait by the car after the fair started, in case she needed to leave quick. I waited. She never came. Did she say who might want her gone? Only that some people can't leave the past alone, and some people can't afford to have it dug up. He crushed the packet. I went back to the tent when the shouting started. Too late. Whatever happened, it happened fast. Miss Marple thanked him and walked on. His fear felt genuine. That did not make him innocent, but it made him useful. By mid-morning, she had returned to Helen's cottage. Helen was in the sitting room, writing letters. Miss Marple sat opposite her and spoke quietly. "Helen, I need you to think carefully. Before you married and came to Little Melford, did you ever spend time on the coast, Eastbourne, or near it?" Helen looked up, surprised. "Once. A short holiday with my mother, years ago. I was still a girl. Why?" "No reason that need worry you yet. Do you remember any particular people? A woman travelling alone? A man in uniform?" Helen shook her head slowly. "It's all very distant. Tea shops and the pier, and my mother worrying about the wind. Nothing that stands out." Miss Marple let the subject rest. Some memories returned only when the right corner was lifted. In the afternoon, the young constable brought news. A boy from the village had found a small silver locket, half buried in the long grass behind the woodpile where the charcoal stick had been taken. The chain was broken. The locket itself was plain on the outside. Inside, under a thin piece of glass, lay a curl of dark hair and the scratched initials H.D. Major Denham identified it at once as the one that had belonged to his late wife. He had believed it lost years earlier, during the confusion of packing after her death. He had not seen it since. His face, when he spoke, was controlled to the point of stiffness. Miss Marple examined the broken chain. The links had been pulled apart with force, not worn through. Someone had wanted the locket open, or wanted it left where it would be found. She walked once more to the churchyard as the day began to cool. The unmarked patch of grass looked ordinary again, yet she could not shake the feeling that the flowers had been both an act of remembrance and a signal, an announcement that the past was still being tended by living hands. Evening brought a light wind. Miss Marple sat by the open window of the guest room, knitting forgotten beside her. Across the green a single lamp burned in the old rectory. In Mrs. Ames's boarding house another light showed in an upper window, Evelyn Hart's, she believed. 2 houses, 2 sets of initials, 1 vanished woman, and a charcoal shadow that still felt less like a threat than a signature. A soft sound rose from the garden below, the careful lowering of the gate latch, just as it had done 2 nights before. Miss Marple did not move to the window at once. She waited, counting the seconds. When she finally looked, the path was empty. Only the roses stirred, yet on the top step of the porch, placed neatly in the centre, lay a single stem of speedwell, its small blue flowers already beginning to close for the night. Miss Marple descended the stairs, lifted the stem, and stood for a long time in the darkening garden. Someone was no longer content to leave flowers only for the dead. Someone wished her to know that the watching continued, and that the next offering might not be so gentle. Chapter 7. The Blue Stem and the Quiet Admission. Miss Marple placed the single stem of speedwell in a thin glass on the windowsill of the guest room. By morning the small blue flowers had closed completely, as though they preferred darkness. She left them there. Some messages were clearer when they were allowed to remain in sight. Helen noticed the stem when she brought up early tea. "That's an odd choice for a vase," she said. "Speedwell doesn't last." "It was left for me," Miss Marple replied, "on the porch step last night. I believe it is meant as a continuation of the flowers that appeared and then vanished in the churchyard." Helen's face tightened. "Someone is playing games with you." "Not games, communication. The difference is important." After breakfast, Miss Marple walked to Mrs. Ames's boarding house and asked for Miss Hart. Evelyn received her in the same small sitting room, but the notebook was nowhere visible. The young woman's eyes moved once to the window, then back. "You found something," Evelyn said. It was not a question. "A stem of speedwell on my doorstep. The same flower that was left on the unmarked grass near the churchyard wall. I thought you might know why someone would choose it." Evelyn was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had lost its careful surface. Speedwell was her favourite. "The woman in blue, Helen Draycott. She told me once, at Eastbourne, that her mother used to pick it by the handful when she was a child. She said the colour reminded her of something she had lost. I didn't ask what. I wish I had." Miss Marple waited. "I spoke to her more than I admitted before," Evelyn continued. "She was staying in the same lodging house for 3 nights. She was restless. She kept touching a locket at her throat. She said a fortune-teller had told her the man she mourned was still alive, and that the knowledge was worse than the grief had been. She didn't know whether to hope or to hate the woman who had spoken." "Did she name the fortune-teller?" "No, but it was Madame Zelda. I saw them speaking on the pier the evening before Mrs. Draycott left. When I asked Madame Zelda about it later, she only smiled and said some truths pay better than others." Evelyn's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "I kept the notebook because I was afraid the story would surface again, and now it has, and someone is leaving her flower for the living as well as the dead." Miss Marple studied her. "Do you know where Helen Draycott went after Eastbourne?" "She said she was going inland, to a quiet place where no one would ask questions. She never named the village. I have wondered, since the fair, whether she meant this one." The thought settled between them like dust. Outside, the morning had grown warmer. Miss Marple left Evelyn with a quiet word of thanks and walked toward the old rectory. She did not go to the door. Instead, she stood at the iron gate and looked at the garden. Major Denham was there, cutting back a climbing rose with steady, practiced movements. He saw her and came forward at once. "Miss Marple, you've heard about the locket, of course." "I have, and I have been thinking about the curl of hair inside it. Dark hair." "Your late wife's, you said." "Yes. Yet the woman at Eastbourne also wore a locket, and the initials match." Denham's mouth hardened. "I told you. Harriet's locket was lost years ago. If this is the same piece, then someone has kept it, and chosen now to leave it where it would be found. That someone is not me." He spoke with force, but his eyes moved past her toward the churchyard, as though measuring the distance between the rectory and the unmarked grass. Miss Marple did not press him further. She merely said, "The flower left for me last night was speedwell. I am told it was Helen Draycott's favourite." Something shifted in Denham's face, too brief to name, too clear to miss. Then it was gone. "I know nothing of her favourites," he said, "or of her." He returned to the roses. Miss Marple watched him for a moment longer, then walked away. By late afternoon, the village had grown restless. Word of the locket had spread in the way such things always did, quietly, incompletely, and with embellishments. Mrs. Latham called at the cottage to declare that fortune-tellers brought nothing but misfortune. Tommy Graves was seen at the railway station, checking the times of the evening trains. The young constable walked the green more often than usual. Miss Marple spent the earlier part of the evening in the cottage garden, her knitting in her hands, her eyes on the path. When the light began to fail, she went upstairs and stood at the guest-room window. The speedwell in the glass was fully closed now, the blue hidden. A movement near the oak caught her attention. A figure stood in the deeper shadow beneath the branches, too far for a face to be clear, yet the posture was familiar, slight, still, watching the cottage. Miss Marple did not call out. She simply remained at the window until the figure turned and walked toward the churchyard path, disappearing among the yews. She waited 10 minutes, then another 5. When she finally went downstairs and opened the front door, the porch step was empty. No new flower, no note. Only, caught on the rough wood of the gatepost, a single thread of dark silk, the same deep red as the scarf that had lain under the table in Madame Zelda's tent. Miss Marple lifted it carefully and closed her hand around it. The past was no longer content with flowers and charcoal. It had begun to leave pieces of itself on her very doorstep, and it intended her to follow. Chapter 8. The Red Thread and the Closed Door. Miss Marple placed the short length of dark red silk on the white cloth of Helen's breakfast table the next morning. In the clear light it looked ordinary, just a pulled thread, frayed at one end, yet both women regarded it in silence. "It matches the scarf in the tent," Helen said at last. "The one found under the table." "Yes, and it was caught on your gatepost last night, after someone stood beneath the oak and watched this house." Helen's hand moved restlessly. "I don't like it, Jane. Flowers, threads, shadows drawn in charcoal. It feels as though we are being led." "We are," Miss Marple agreed. "The question is whether we are being led toward the truth or away from it." She spent the morning in quiet movement about the village. At the Red Lion she learned from Wilkins that Tommy Graves had left on the early train to Brighton, carrying only a small bag. He had paid his shot and said nothing of returning. At the post office, Mrs. Rowe confirmed that no further letters had arrived for Madame Zelda. At the churchyard, the unmarked patch of grass remained bare. No new flowers had appeared. By noon, Miss Marple turned her steps toward the old rectory once more. This time she did not stop at the gate. The front door stood open to the warm air. She heard the sound of drawers being opened and closed with unusual force. When she knocked, the sound ceased at once. Major Denham appeared in the hallway, his face set. A cupboard door behind him remained ajar, showing the edge of a wooden box. "Miss Marple, I was not expecting callers. I shall not keep you long. I found something last night that may belong to the matter we discussed." She held out the red thread on her open palm. Denham looked at it but did not take it. "A scrap of silk. From the tent, I assume. From my goddaughter's gatepost. Left or caught after someone watched the cottage from the oak." His eyes lifted to hers. "You think it was me?" "I think nothing yet. I only observe that the scarf in the tent was red, that Madame Zelda is still missing, and that the past keeps leaving small pieces of itself where I will find them." Denham stepped aside, a silent invitation. In the drawing room, the silver-framed photograph of his late wife remained on the side table. Miss Marple noticed that the locket at the woman's throat looked identical in shape to the one recovered from the wood pile. "I have been searching," Denham said abruptly, "for anything that might explain how Harriet's locket left my possession and ended behind a woodpile in this village. I found nothing, only the usual papers, service records, a few letters from solicitors." He paused, then added, "There was one thing I had forgotten. After Harriet died, a woman wrote to me, anonymous. She claimed she had seen my wife in England months after I had buried her in India. I dismissed it as cruelty or delusion. I burned the letter. Now I wonder whether I was too hasty." Miss Marple's needles of thought clicked softly. Did the letter mention a place? Only the south coast, nothing more. She left him soon after. The open cupboard and the wooden box stayed in her mind. Some searches were performed for the benefit of witnesses. Others were genuine. She was not yet certain which kind she had interrupted. In the late afternoon, she returned to Mrs. Ames's boarding house. Evelyn Hart was not in the sitting room. Mrs. Ames, polishing the banister with unnecessary vigour, said the young woman had gone out walking and had taken her notebook with her. "Toward the downs," Mrs. Ames added. "She often does when she wants to be alone, though alone is a relative word in a village this size." Miss Marple thanked her and walked in the same direction. The path climbed gently between hedgerows heavy with summer growth. At the first rise she saw Evelyn ahead, sitting on a low stile, the notebook open on her knees. The younger woman looked up at the sound of footsteps, but did not close the book. "I thought you might follow," Evelyn said. "I thought you might wish to be found." Evelyn glanced at the open page. The writing there was newer, the ink darker. "I remembered something more. The night before Helen Draycott left Eastbourne, she showed me the inside of her locket. There was a curl of hair and the initials. She said the hair belonged to the man she had lost. Not a mother's, a man's. She had scratched the letters herself after the fortune-teller spoke." Miss Marple felt the quiet shift of a piece settling into place. "So there may have been two lockets." or one locket whose story changed according to the teller, or one locket that passed from hand to hand, Evelyn replied. Madame Zelda collected things, tokens, promises, secrets. She told me once that the best payment was not always money. A cloud passed across the sun, throwing the path into sudden shade. Evelyn closed the notebook. I'm frightened, she said simply. Not of ghosts, of whoever decided Madame Zelda had spoken enough. They walked back together in silence. At the edge of the village, Evelyn went toward the boarding house. Miss Marple continued to Helen's cottage. The green was empty except for a few late swallows. On the porch step, placed with the same neat care as the speedwell, lay a second object, a single tarot card. The Hanged Man. Its edges were slightly bent, as though it had been carried in a pocket. On the back, in pencil, someone had written 4 words. She should have left. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. The card was identical to those scattered in the tent on the day Madame Zelda vanished. Inside the cottage, the clock ticked with ordinary calm. Outside, the village prepared for evening. And somewhere close, the person who had watched from the oak and left red silk on the gate was still choosing what to leave next, and how much longer to remain unseen. Miss Marple stood with the card in her hand, and felt the story tighten around her like a drawn thread. The next pull, she knew, would not be gentle. Chapter 9. The Hanged Man and the Second Letter. Miss Marple laid the tarot card on the sitting-room table beside the closed stem of speedwell and the short length of red silk. 3 small objects, each left for her to find, each carrying the same quiet insistence that the past was not finished with Little Melford. Helen stood looking down at them with folded arms. The Hanged Man, she said. I don't know the meaning, but I don't like the look of it. Suspension, Miss Marple answered. Sacrifice. A man or woman hanging between one truth and another. And the note on the back is plain enough. Someone believes Madame Zelda was given a choice and refused it. She did not add the rest of her thought, that the same someone now seemed interested in whether Miss Marple herself would leave the matter alone. The morning brought a thin mist that clung to the green and softened the outlines of the oak. Miss Marple walked through it to the churchyard. The unmarked patch of grass near the far wall was no longer bare. A fresh bunch of speedwell and buttercups lay there, the stems still beaded with moisture. Beside them, face up on the earth, rested a second tarot card. The moon, illusion, secrets. The path that is not as clear as it appears. Miss Marple did not touch it at once. She stood looking at the 2 cards in her mind. The Hanged Man left on her porch, the moon left for the dead, and felt the pattern tighten. Whoever was placing them knew the deck and knew the story behind it. Footsteps approached along the path. Major Denham stopped a few yards away. His eyes moved from the flowers to the card and then to Miss Marple. You found another, he said. Yes, and you are here early, Major. I walk this way most mornings. Habit. He paused. I have something I should have shown you yesterday. I found it last night, in a box of old correspondence I had not opened since I returned to England. From his pocket he took a folded sheet of cream paper, thinner than the threatening letter in Madame Zelda's case, but of similar quality. The writing was uneven, as though written in haste or strong feeling. You buried the wrong woman. She is alive and using another name. If you want the truth, come to the summer fair at Little Melford. She will be there. Ask the fortune teller. She knows the whole of it. There was no signature. The date at the top was 3 weeks earlier. Denham's voice was low. I dismissed it, as I dismissed the first anonymous letter years ago. I told myself it was the same cruelty. Then Madame Zelda vanished, and the locket appeared. And now these cards. I no longer know what I am dismissing. Miss Marple read the letter twice. The paper carried a faint trace of lavender, the same scent that had clung to the threat delivered to Madame Zelda. Someone wished you here, she said. At this fair, at this moment. The fortune teller was the arranged meeting point. When she disappeared, the arrangement broke. Denham looked at the unmarked grass. Do you believe my wife is alive? I believe someone wants you to believe it. Whether they are telling the truth or using an old grief as a tool is another matter. They stood in silence while the mist began to lift. At last Denham said, "What do you intend to do?" "Speak again with Miss Hart. And then, I think, I must look more carefully at the night Madame Zelda vanished. Someone drew that charcoal shadow while the choir was singing. That person was close, calm, and certain they would not be interrupted." She left him in the churchyard and walked to Mrs. Ames's house. Evelyn Hart was in the sitting room, the notebook open, a pen idle in her hand. When she saw Miss Marple's face, she closed the book at once. "There's been another card," Miss Marple said. "The moon, left with flowers on the unmarked ground. And Major Denham has received a letter telling him his wife lives and that Madame Zelda knew the truth." Evelyn's colour faded. "I never wrote any letter. I did not say you had. But you know more of Helen Draycott than you have yet spoken. The time for keeping pieces back is ending." Evelyn rose and went to the window. For a long moment, she watched the mist thin across the green. When she turned back, her voice was steady though very quiet. "Helen Draycott told me one thing more before she left Eastbourne. She said the man she had loved was not lost at sea. He had chosen to disappear. He had a wife already, a wife he had left in another country. She had followed the rumour of him as far as the coast, and the fortune-teller had only confirmed what she already feared. She was going inland to decide whether to keep looking or to let him stay dead." Miss Marple felt the final shift of understanding begin. "And the initials," she said. "H.D. She scratched them herself, not for a dead husband, for the living man she could not name." Evelyn nodded once. She never said his name, only that he had returned to England and taken a quiet house in a quiet place. She intended to find the house. Outside, the mist had almost cleared. The oak stood sharp against the brightening sky. Miss Marple walked back slowly across the green, the 2 tarot cards and the new letter turning in her mind like cards themselves, waiting to be laid in their proper order. At Helen's gate she paused. The porch step was empty. No new offering waited. Yet the silence felt deliberate, as though the unseen hand had finished placing clues and was now waiting to see whether she would follow them to their end. Miss Marple went inside, closed the door, and stood for a moment in the cool hall. The shadow on the canvas had never been only a warning, it had been an invitation, and the invitation was about to be answered. Chapter 10. The Quiet House and the Name Spoken Aloud. The mist had burned away completely by mid-morning, leaving the village washed and bright. Miss Marple sat in Helen's sitting room with the 2 tarot cards, the red thread, the Speedwell stem, and Major Denham's anonymous letter arranged on the table before her. She did not move them. She simply looked until the pattern stopped shifting and held still. Helen watched from the doorway. "You've decided something." "I have decided that Madame Zelda was not the only person brought to Little Melford for a purpose." Major Denham was summoned. The fortune-teller was the appointed messenger. When the messenger disappeared, the message had to be delivered another way, by flowers, by cards, by a locket left in the grass. She rose and put on her hat. "I am going to the rectory, and then, I think, I shall need to speak with Miss Hart one final time." Major Denham received her in the drawing-room without pretence of surprise. The silver-framed photograph still stood on the side table, but the wooden box she had glimpsed earlier now sat open on the desk. Papers lay in careful piles. "You have come about the letter," he said. "I have come about the woman who wrote it, and about the woman it concerns." Miss Marple sat. Helen Draycott came to Eastbourne looking for a man who had chosen to disappear. A man who already had a wife. She carried a locket with a curl of his hair, and the initials she scratched herself. She intended to follow him inland, to a quiet house in a quiet place. This village matches the description. Your arrival matches the timing, and someone went to considerable trouble to place you and Madame Zelda in the same fairground on the same afternoon. Denham stood very still. The colour had left his face, yet his voice remained even. "Harriet died in India. I buried her. I have the certificates. The letters from the doctor. The witnesses. Certificates can be arranged. Witnesses can be persuaded, or mistaken. Miss Marple's tone held no accusation, only the quiet persistence of fact. The anonymous letter you received 3 weeks ago did not speak of a ghost. It spoke of a woman using another name. Alive. Denham turned to the window. For a long time he said nothing. When he spoke again, the words came slowly, as though each one cost him effort. There was a difficulty in the last year of our marriage. A separation of understanding. I was posted up country. She remained in the station. There was talk, nothing proven, of another man. When I returned, she was ill. The fever took her quickly. I held her hand at the end. I closed her eyes. If she is alive, then the woman I buried was not Harriet, and I do not know how that could be. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle before she answered. Or the woman who died was Harriet, and the woman who came looking for you was someone else entirely, someone who had loved you under another name, or believed she had cause to. The locket, the hair, the initials, the fortune-teller's confirmation, all of it could be built from longing and a few stolen facts. Madame Zelda dealt in such materials. Denham faced her. Then where is Madame Zelda? That, Miss Marple said, rising, is the question that still requires an answer. Everything else may be illusion. Her disappearance is not. She left the rectory and walked directly to Mrs. Ames's boarding house. Evelyn Hart was not in the sitting room. Mrs. Ames, her polishing cloth still in hand, reported that the young woman had gone out more than an hour earlier, notebook under her arm, and had taken the path toward the downs once more. She looked properly upset, Mrs. Ames added. I asked if she wanted company, and she said company was the last thing she needed. Miss Marple followed the path. The hedgerows were busy with insects. The air smelled of warm grass and distant hay. At the stile where she had found Evelyn before, there was no one. Only a single page torn from a notebook, weighted with a small stone so it would not blow away. The writing was hurried. I was wrong about the quiet house. She found it. She spoke to him. And then she understood why the fortune-teller had to disappear. I am going to the place where the flowers are left. If I am not back by evening, tell Miss Marple the name Helen Draycott was using in the village. It was not Draycott. The final line was darker, pressed hard into the paper. It was Denham. Miss Marple folded the page carefully and put it in her handbag. The downs stretched empty and golden under the noon sun. No figure moved among them. She turned back toward the village, at a pace that made no concession to the heat. The churchyard was the first place to search. The unmarked grass near the wall still held its fresh flowers, but Evelyn was not there. The Red Lion yard was empty of anyone who had seen her. The green itself held only a few children chasing a dog. By the time Miss Marple reached Helen's cottage, her breathing had quickened. Helen met her at the door, alarm already gathering in her face. Jane! What has happened? Miss Marple drew the torn page from her bag and placed it on the table beside the tarot cards. Miss Hart has gone to meet the past, she said, and she has left us the name it has been using. Outside, a cloud crossed the sun, and the garden fell into brief shadow. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, a gate closed with a sound almost too soft to hear. The charcoal figure on the tent wall had raised one hand, as if in warning or farewell. Miss Marple now understood that the farewell might not have been for Madame Zelda alone. Time, at last, had begun to run short. Chapter 11. The Place Where the Flowers Are Left. Miss Marple did not wait for the constable. She did not wait for Major Denham. She told Helen only that she was going to the churchyard, and that if she had not returned within the hour, Helen was to fetch both men at once. Then she took her handbag and walked out into the bright afternoon. The path through the yews was cool and still. Sound from the village reached her only faintly, the distant bark of a dog, the low hum of a motor car on the high street. Ahead, the far wall of the churchyard came into view, and with it, the unmarked patch of grass. Evelyn Hart stood there. She was not alone. Major Denham faced her, his back partly turned to the path. His voice carried in the quiet air, controlled but strained. You should not have written that name, he said. You should not have come here. Evelyn held her notebook against her chest like a shield. Someone had to. Madame Zelda knew. That is why she is gone. Helen Draycott, Helen Denham, came to this village last autumn. She took a room for 6 days under that name. She watched the rectory. She saw you, and then she vanished, just as completely as the fortune-teller has now. Miss Marple stepped from the shadow of the yews. Both of them turned. I think, she said mildly, that we have reached the point where unfinished stories become dangerous. Denham's face was grey. Miss Marple, this is not— It is precisely the place. She came forward until she stood within a few feet of them. Miss Hart left a clear message. The woman we have been calling Helen Draycott used the name Denham while she was here. She came looking for a man who had let the world believe he was free. She found him, and shortly afterwards she disappeared. Madame Zelda, who had confirmed her hopes on the coast, was brought here by anonymous letters and then removed when she threatened to speak. The charcoal shadow, the cards, the flowers, these were not random. They were the work of someone who needed the past to stay silent and who has begun to panic now that it will not. Evelyn's voice trembled but held. I kept the notebook because I was afraid. I saw her, Miss Marple, last September, walking this same path at dusk. She told me she had found the quiet house. She said the man inside it had looked at her as though she were a ghost he had already buried once. The next morning her room at the lodging house was empty. No note, no forwarding address, only a single stem of speedwell left on the pillow. Denham closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the careful soldier's composure had cracked. I did not harm her, he said. I told her the truth, that Harriet was dead, that whatever hope she carried was built on a fortune-teller's lie and her own longing. She left angry. She said the past was not finished with me. That is the last time I saw her. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. And yet someone continued to leave flowers on this ground, someone who knew Speedwell was her favourite, someone who placed tarot cards for me to find, someone who drew a seated shadow on a tent wall while a woman vanished a few feet away. A soft sound came from the deeper yews behind the wall, the shift of weight on dry earth. All three of them turned. Mrs. Latham, the vicar's wife, stood half-hidden among the dark branches. Her usual expression of righteous certainty was gone. In its place was something older and far more tired. In one hand she held a small bunch of speedwell and buttercups. In the other, the remaining cards from Madame Zelda's scattered deck. I told her to leave, Mrs. Latham said. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. Both times. The first woman and then the fortune-teller. Some things are better left buried. My brother learned that too late. He was the man Helen Denham followed. He died in France in 1944. But before he died he wrote letters, foolish, passionate letters, to a woman who was not his wife. When Helen came looking, she carried one of those letters. She threatened to show it to the village, to the church, to everyone who remembered him as a hero. I could not allow that. Miss Marple felt the final pieces settle with the soft click of a lock closing. You met Madame Zelda before the fair, she said. You learned she intended to speak. You arranged the threat. And when she still opened her tent, you waited until the choir began to sing. Mrs. Latham's mouth twisted. She laughed at me. She said secrets were her living, and she would not be told which ones to keep. I only meant to frighten her. The charcoal was meant as a warning she would understand. But she struggled, and then it was too late. Evelyn stepped back, one hand covering her mouth. Denham moved as if to take the cards from Mrs. Latham, but Miss Marple's small gesture stopped him. Where is she? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Latham looked down at the unmarked grass. Where the flowers are left, she said simply. I thought it fitting. She had no one else who would remember her correctly. The churchyard held its breath. Somewhere beyond the wall, a blackbird called once and fell silent. Miss Marple spoke into the stillness. You will come with us now, Mrs. Latham. There has been enough silence in this place. For a moment it seemed the older woman might refuse. Then her hands opened. The flowers fell. The tarot cards scattered across the grass. The tower, the moon, the hanged man, landing face up in the same cruel order they had appeared from the beginning. She did not resist when Denham took her arm. As they turned toward the lich gate, Miss Marple looked once more at the unmarked ground. The shadow that had been drawn on the tent wall had finally found its resting place, and the summer fair, which had begun with music and children's voices, would end with the quiet, necessary work of truth. One chapter of the story remained. The dead, at last, were about to be given their names. Chapter 12. The Names Beneath the Grass. The young constable arrived first, breathless and pale. Major Denham spoke to him in low, precise sentences, while Mrs. Latham stood without resistance beside the churchyard wall. She had the look of a woman who had been carrying a weight for so long that its sudden removal left her unsteady on her feet. Miss Marple remained a few steps apart, her handbag over her arm, watching the light move across the unmarked grass. Helen Carrington came next, summoned by the constable's message. She went straight to her godmother and took her arm without speaking. Evelyn Hart stood near the yews, the notebook still pressed against her chest, her face white but composed. No one suggested she leave. She had earned the right to see the ending. By late afternoon, the quiet machinery of authority had taken over. Men from the neighbouring town arrived with the necessary tools and the necessary seriousness. The vicar, Mr. Latham, was called from the vestry. When he understood what his wife had confessed, he sat down heavily on a low stone and did not rise for a long time. No one disturbed him. They found Madame Zelda first. She had been placed carefully, almost respectfully, in a shallow space behind the far wall where the yews grew thickest. The red scarf that had lain under the table in the tent was missing. The rest of her clothing was orderly. The medical man who examined her spoke of a single blow and the absence of prolonged struggle. Mrs. Latham, when asked, repeated what she had already said. She had meant only to frighten, and then fear had done the rest. The second discovery took longer. The unmarked patch of grass where the speedwell and buttercups had been left yielded its secret as the light began to soften. Helen Denham, once called Draycott, once called by other names in other towns, had been buried there the previous autumn. There was no violence visible after so many months, only the quiet fact of a life ended and hidden. In a small cloth bag beside her lay a locket, empty of hair, and a single folded letter in a soldier's hand. The letter was never read aloud. Mr. Latham took it, unread, and later placed it in the fire at the vicarage. Some truths, Miss Marple thought, did not need to travel further than the people already wounded by them. Evening settled over Little Melford with unusual gentleness. The police took Mrs. Latham away in a closed car. The vicar remained in the churchyard long after the others had gone, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, as though waiting for a service to begin. Major Denham walked Evelyn Hart back to Mrs. Ames's boarding house in silence. At the door he stopped and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Evelyn nodded once, then went inside without looking back. Miss Marple and Helen returned to the cottage. The sitting room still held the small collection of objects that had marked the path of the mystery: the closed speedwell, the red thread, the 2 tarot cards, the anonymous letters. Helen began to gather them up, then stopped. "What do we do with these?" "We let them become ordinary again," Miss Marple said. "That is the kindest fate for such things." They burned the cards and the thread in the kitchen grate. The speedwell they carried out to the garden and laid beneath the roses. The letters Major Denham had already taken into his own keeping. What he did with them was no longer their concern. Later, when the house was quiet, Miss Marple sat by the open window of the guest room with her knitting. The needles moved steadily. Across the green, the oak tree stood black against a sky the colour of old pewter. The place where the tent had been was no longer visible. Grass had already begun to cover the scars of the fair. She thought of the charcoal shadow, the seated figure with one hand raised. It had been drawn in panic and anger, yet it had also been the first true confession of the crime. Everything that followed had been only the slow work of reading what the hand had already written on the canvas. Helen came upstairs with 2 cups of cocoa and sat on the edge of the bed. "Will the village recover?" she asked. "Villages always recover," Miss Marple replied. "They have had practice. There will be talk for a season, and then the talk will become story, and then the story will become something that happened to other people a long time ago. The church roof will still need mending. The children will still sing next summer. Life is very persistent. Helen was silent for a while. Then she said, "You knew it was her before we reached the churchyard, didn't you?" "I suspected. The flowers were local. The knowledge of the cards was precise. The anger was old and personal. Mrs. Latham had disapproved of the fortune-teller from the beginning, with more heat than principle required. And she was the only person who could move about the green during the choir's performance without drawing the slightest notice. Respectability is a remarkably effective disguise." Helen shook her head, half in wonder, half in residual fear. "I shall never again look at a village fair in quite the same way." "That," said Miss Marple, "is probably wise." She finished the row of knitting and laid the work aside. Outside, a light went on in the old rectory, and then, after a few minutes, went out again. In Mrs. Ames's upper window, another light burned steadily. The village was settling, carefully, back into itself. Miss Marple thought of the two women who had come looking for answers, and found only silence. She thought of the brother whose wartime letters had outlived him and caused such ruin. She thought of the charcoal line on the tent wall, now long since dismantled and gone. In the end, the shadow had belonged to everyone who had tried to keep the past from speaking, and the past, as it always did, had spoken anyway. She rose and closed the window against the cooling air. Tomorrow there would be statements to give and arrangements to be made. Tonight there was only the quiet house, the finished knitting, and the knowledge that the dead had finally been given their proper names. Miss Marple turned out the lamp. In the darkness the garden smelled of roses and distant grass, and the long summer evening of Little Melford came at last to its close.